I'm always inspired when I read the biography of missionaries, and one of my favorites is Adoniram Judson. And we have in this church, this is a church where we have missionary mom, missionary children, parents of missionaries. We have children of missionaries, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren of missionaries that are here every Sunday. And Adoniram was one of the first Americans to go as a foreign missionary from the United States in the early 1800s. He was 24 years of age when he decided to set sail from America and go to India and then to Burma, where he would share the gospel and tell people about Jesus. Now, Burma at the time was considered very hostile to the faith, and there was no known missionaries that were in this country at the time. But Adoniram Judson felt like that this is where God was calling him to go, and this is where he was supposed to go. Now, he was in love with a young lady named Anne. And Anne, when I say this, he wanted to marry Anne, and he wanted the two of them to go as missionaries. And so, again, this was something that she began to think about and wrestle with. But before they got married, Adoniram sent a letter to the father, and here's what it says. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. I remember visiting Kathy's dad before we were to get married, and all I can say is I don't think my conversation compares anything like this. I was pretty weak back then. No doubt about it. Anyway, but I keep going. He says, can you consent to all of this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of the perishing, immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all of this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness? Her father responded, she can make up her own mind. So I guess she did. In 1813, they were married and they set sail for Burma. They experienced hardship after hardship after hardship. Those words of asking the dad were almost prophetic as to some of the things that would happen. In 1824, Adoniram was put in prison for 18 months, and he wasted away. He was unrecognizable, had hollow eyes, nearly crippled from all the torture. He was in prison when he found that his wife Anne was expecting their baby. At night, Adoniram would have his feet tied together, and the jailer would hoist his feet into the air so that only the back of his shoulders and the back of his head would be resting on the ground. And that's how he would sleep, in the heat and with the mosquitoes trying to eat him alive. His pregnant wife Anne would walk 2 miles every day and plead for him to be released. While in prison, his daughter Maria was born. Then Anne became very sick, and she was as thin as Adoniram, and her milk dried up. And the jailer had mercy on them for a number of months, and he let Judson out of prison each evening so that they could go and take this baby into a nearby village and beg other nursing mothers to nurse Maria. The title of this sermon series is Get Over Yourself. Get over yourself. To be honest, every single one of us need to get over ourselves. There's not one of us in here that doesn't. And it's a little hard to get over ourselves. Now today we're going to talk about eternal over temporary. When the theme of the message is get over yourself, It's as though we should address this subject maybe apologetically. We don't want to offend anybody. We know it's a lot to ask when we're talking about serving the Lord or giving. Then you hear a story like this about the missionaries like the Judsons, and you think, I got a ways to go in getting over myself. I'll be honest, it is humble to preach today after reading you that story and after thinking about what some people have given up for the sake of sharing Jesus with others. It's a challenge to get over yourself. The challenge is for us to realize and come to a point in our life when we realize the temporary pleasures of happiness and success, we don't need to look at those so much as we most of the time do, and we need to see eternally. We need to look at eternity over the temporary. Now we're in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and I'm going to look at verses 16 and 17. Paul is writing these words to teach the Ephesians, and he's pastoring, teaching Timothy with these words. Now, Ephesus has a lot in common with the Western culture. A lot of the advice that he's trying to give is this get over yourself mentality. Stop looking at life and relationships and money and decisions through the lens of the temporary. Stop looking at life and relationships and decisions and money start looking at life and relationships and decisions and money through the lenses of eternity. Realize your eternal decisions are greater than your temporary decisions. 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 7 says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." When you start looking at life through the lens of eternity, then Adoniram and Ann Judson, their life doesn't seem so crazy. In fact, from an eternal perspective, it all makes sense. The Bible says in the book of James that our life is like a mist. It's there in the morning, and then in a little while it's gone. And that's the way life will be for each and every one of us. I remember the other day when Kathy and I got married, that's a long time ago in most of your eyes. I can remember those things, but it just passes so fast. They say only one life will soon be passed, and only what's done for Christ will last. When you hear a story like the Judsons, it's instinctive, though, I think, for us to feel sorry for them. Anne, a wife, a mother, she'd counted the cost of what she was going to give up. She didn't go into this blindly. She processed the decision, and again, I'm going to read you a little bit of a letter that she wrote to her best friend, Lydia Kimball, trying to think through her decision. She wrote, "I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and to go where God and His providence shall see fit to place me." And Ann Judson knew what she was doing. She was giving up these comforts and conveniences and relationships. She was giving up something she loved for something that she loved even more. Mission work in the 1800s was a one-way trip. a one-way ticket. There was no plane. There were no, coming homes for the holidays. There were no furloughs. There was no Skype. There was no FaceTime. There were no cell phones. When she said goodbye to her family, she would say goodbye, and she knew what she was doing. And you can feel sorry for her, for everything that she had to endure, and the fact that her family probably had to endure some of these things with her. But she doesn't feel sorry for herself. But I would say to you today, if she was to feel sorry for anybody, she'd feel sorry for you. She'd probably feel sorry for me, because we get so attached to the stuff of this world, and we look so much with temporary lenses. We come on Sundays, we sit in comfortable seats, and maybe the greatest thought on a lot of our minds is, what's for lunch? What are we going to have? My stomach's kind of growling. Well, we'll get home, we'll eat our lunch, and we'll do a few chores and, things that we need to do around the house. And maybe this afternoon we'll feel sorry for the Judsons. But I don't think they're feeling sorry for themselves. I think they're feeling sorry for you and for me. They've entered eternity, and they're not regretting their investment in heaven. Jesus kind of predicted some of the thoughts about this when he said, "And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much, and will inherit eternal life." Jesus is saying the point of this life is to prepare for eternity. Someone says, "What am I here for? What's God's purpose in my life?" The purpose and point of this life is to prepare for the next life. And Jesus says, invest in your life for my kingdom, and you'll receive 10,000% in return. Live life with eternity in mind. Don't get sidetracked by all the temporary. In 1 Timothy 6, I'm paraphrasing some of it, says, "You make sure you remind the people who are wealthy in this world to be intentional when it comes to their heavenly portfolios." Paul is challenging the Christians, and he's challenging you, and he's challenging me. Don't get too caught up in the conveniences and comforts of this life or of this world. In that verse 18 where it says, "Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that's truly life." Ephesus was a country that was developed a lot more than you might think. The people that were well off, those people had indoor plumbing. Those people actually had hot and cold water. This was over 2,000 years ago. Don't think that your life is going to be defined by, I don't know, the car that you drive, or the size of your house, or the number of dollars that are in your Edward Jones account. I know it's hard to believe that when you see all the commercials on TV, or all the pop-up ads on your computer or on your cell phone, the world the world lives its life through the lens of the temporary and whatever we can get next. And God wants you to stop looking through those lenses and start looking through the lens of eternity. Paul is challenging the Christians to be intentional, to look at life through the lens of eternity. Tell them to use their money to do good, that they should be rich in good works. Where he's talking about they will be storing up their treasures as a good foundation for the future. He's talking about heaven, that we should be looking to heaven. Verse 17, and I'm going backwards this way, but it just says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Don't put your hope in money or things or stuff. It's all temporary. In fact, it can be here today and it can be gone tomorrow. Invest your money, invest your life in something that really lasts. When you give of your time or your talent or your treasures, when you give to the Lord, you're giving for eternity. You demonstrate your love and your kindness and your compassion. Now in the book of Luke, It's in chapter 12. If you want to take your Bibles and move to Luke 12, we're going to move there. Because there's a parallel story that Jesus tells. And Jesus is kind of saying this at the first of chapter 12. I'm going to jump in at verse 5, I think. But anyway, he says, don't worry what men think about you. You know, don't get too caught up in what people say about you on social media. Don't let that ruin your day. Don't be preoccupied with whether or not everybody agrees with you. Don't worry so much if you don't get the respect you deserve, or you are not honored in the way you think you should be. You go through this life and people may not treat you fairly, or they may think ill of you. But Jesus is going to say, hey, don't worry about those, and then in verse 5 he says this, but I will show you whom you should fear. You worry about something? Fear him who after your body has been killed has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. We need to look at life through the lens of eternity. Don't get caught up in impressing all the people who are around you. Don't buy into the facade of this world. Don't forget about eternity. Don't forget about God. Fear God. It's almost hilarious, and it's sort of sad. There's a dude that's in church this day with Jesus talking, I guess. You don't want to say in church that day, as he's listening to Jesus teach. And look what he says. It's down in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Well, this is probably the younger brother. I don't know what's going on. And he's telling Jesus, tell the older brother he isn't being fair to me. Under the Levitical law, actually the older brother would get 2/3. It wasn't always followed, and sometimes it was more equitably split up. But he's coming to Jesus, and he comes to Jesus, and it's as if he's asking a question about money, and the inheritance. Well, he's not asking a question at all. That's not what he said. He's not asking a question. He's actually telling Jesus to agree with him with what he already thinks about money and what he already thinks about life and things. And it's kind of sad how that's the way many of us, when we approach the Lord, that's the way we approach Him. We open up the Bible and it's not so much as, God, I want to make sure you agree with me on this as I study through it. No, we study through it like, okay, I gotta show everybody that God agrees with me on this. And I don't know, as a preacher, over the years I've been to a lot of funerals, done a lot of funerals. I have seen family members upset at funerals. They've lost their mother and the siblings aren't talking to each other, and you're like, what's going on? And somebody says, well, it's all about the 1997 Oldsmobile. And you're like, what? It's about the 1997 Oldsmobile. There's some disagreement over who should get the car. A 1997 Oldsmobile, nobody would want it if they would give it to you. But if somebody else wants it, then I'm going to want it. I'm going to want it. I don't know. It's, just the principle of the matter. And we start prioritizing the wrong things and putting the emphasis in the wrong areas. And relationships take a back seat to money and possessions. Well, Jesus replies to this dude who comes and interrupts him as he's trying to get people to think eternally and not think about temporary. Jesus replied, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between you? Then he said to them, watch out, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Now it says that he was a rich man, and he'd been very blessed, and what's he going to do with all this success? In verse 18, he goes on and says, and then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Well, you probably do know you need to get over yourself if the conversation that you're having is about how successful and prosperous you are. 9 times in these 2 verses he says, mine, my grain, my goods, myself. Well, does he think about God? Is he thinking about God? Is he thinking about others? Is he looking through the lens of eternity? Or with the temporary lenses on? He may be looking 30 years down the road, but is he looking, 300 years or a generation or 2 down the road? It's all about him. And God looks down from heaven in verse 20 and says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then Jesus concludes the story this way. This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Who is not rich toward God. It's not the fact that he's rich or he's successful or he has abundance or that he's been very blessed. That is not the problem at all. The problem is he's not rich toward God. The problem is he's ignoring God. The problem is with all of his decisions, he's not worried about God or thinking about other people. He doesn't give to God of his time, of his talent, of his treasures. His interests are his temporary pleasures or his temporary comforts. And Jesus says he's a fool because tonight he's going to die. I was reading about former CEO of Gillette. His name's Coleman Mockler. He was thought to be a model leader. Forbes magazine, a guy drew a picture of him on the June 25th, 1991. This is the cover of the Forbes magazine. An artist had done a rendering of Mockler standing atop of a mountain, with this giant razor in his hand, in this victorious pose. He was a Harvard Business School graduate. He had spent 16 years as the CEO of Gillette, and he'd brought the Gillette company to new levels of success that it had not seen. Well, an advance copy of this magazine arrived to his office. And as he was coming into work that day, all the employees had heard about it. And in the business, applause broke out for him as he was holding that picture of the magazine and as he was walking in his office. He walked in his office, he shut his door, and he died on the floor that moment. Now, this guy was actually a guy that went to church. He actually was someone, I don't know about. But I'm just telling you, you don't know when you're checking out. I don't know when I'm checking out. It may be today. It may be tomorrow. We don't know. But God says to this guy that's checking out, you fool. He doesn't seem like such a bad guy. I mean, he's a success and he's an example of financial success. He is probably a guy who lives in one of the nicer neighborhoods or nicer houses, but he's not blowing money on while living. In fact, he's being financially responsible. I would say he was probably a planner. He's going to build some bigger barns and he's going to secure his future is what he's thinking. But God calls him a fool. And God tells you and I never to call anyone a fool. But God calls him a fool because he is not considering eternity. He's not considering eternity. He's focused on the temporary and he's ignoring the eternal. John Ortberg, in his book, It All Goes Back in the Box, he says there's a two-word question that most people tend not to ask. The two-word question, then what? Then what? Once I have that promotion, once I make that purchase, once I live in that home, once I have this kind of security because of the funds, once I have accomplished this goal, then what? What are you going to do? Then what? What are we going to do when we get to the top? Do you think God is going to be impressed by your financial portfolio? I don't really think He is. I don't really think He is. Think past the nice vacation. Think past the dream home. Think past a relaxing retirement and ask yourself, then what? So Jesus tells a story, and I think it's trying to help this man in Luke 12 get perspective so he's focused not on the temporary but on the eternal. You know, when I say we never know when we're going to check out, I'd done a funeral of a young person that had passed away, and it was no fault of their own. It was just mistakes that were made, not even by them, but it caused their death. And you know, it's so hard when somebody dies that's young, but you never know when. Oh, we were playing charades at the house one day, and I'm just saying, we're not that weird that we play charades. We mostly play cards and different things. But the kids were like, "Hey, what's this like?" And "Hey, who is this?" When they and it's okay if you play charades, okay? But but my daughter said, "Oh, I got one. I got one." And she held her hands out like she was on a cell phone. She was, and everybody said, "Oh, that's Dad. He's always on his cell phone. He's always working as hard as he can." And I do. I work hard. But I had tears in my eyes that day because I thought, I hope that is not all that she sees of me. I hope that's not all that she sees of me. You know, we have to do a reality check. Do we get lost in the temporary, or are we thinking about eternity? Jesus didn't say this guy was wrong for having money or for having success or for, you know, having a big house or whatever he had. What he said was he was a fool because he was ignoring eternity. Don't ignore eternity. He finishes this section of Luke 12. He says to this guy, you know, was worried about, hey, my brother's getting the 93 Oldsmobile or whatever. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. A treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So our kids are headed on a mission trip, and they're going to the Dominican Republic. Well, I don't know. Maybe some of them are thinking about going to the mission field. Maybe some of them are thinking, you know, Larry's getting old, Larry's going to retire. Maybe I need to be a preacher. I hope they're thinking stuff like that, because the Lord could use you. Adoniram Judson faced 40 years of opposition, 40 years of suffering, but it was temporary. And in that time, he and his wife translated an entire Bible into the Burmese language. He outlived 7 of his own children, but when he died, there were more than 7,000 children of God in Burma. Today, there are more than 3,700 churches that trace the beginning to the day that Adoniram and Ann Judson decided to set sail. Not to look at the temporary, but to look to the eternal. Would y'all stand?